All right. Hey, I'm glad you're here with us today. We're in the final week of Joseph's story. And as we've been going through this series, you probably have seen, just like in our own lives, this story hasn't been very clean or simple or easy. And so, just by way of reminder, this is a few things that we've seen so far. Joseph has been favored by his father. And so we have some family drama. He was hated by his brothers. He was betrayed. He was sold. He was lied about. He was falsely accused. He was forgotten, imprisoned. He was left waiting. And then somehow, through all that grossness, what we've also seen is God's grace throughout this entire story. We've seen God's hand all over this story. Because God was with Joseph in the pit, and at Potiphar's house, and in prison. And when Pharaoh called him, and when God raised him up and he gave him wisdom and he used him to preserve the lives of many during a deep, deep, deep famine. And so after all these kind of twists and turns through his life and through his story, after all the pain, after all the providence, we come to one of the clearest statements, I think, in all of Scripture about how God works in a broken world. And we see that in Genesis 50, verse 20. This is what we've been building up to. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. If you grew up maybe in an earlier version of these Bibles, it says what you meant for evil, God meant for good. You intended harm, but God intended good. And so here's what we've been saying through this whole series, right? That verse does not pretend that evil is good. It doesn't pretend that the evil never happened, that the harm never happened. It doesn't minimize Joseph's brothers' sin and what they did. It doesn't say, well, man, it really wasn't that bad. Joseph looks his brothers in the eye and he says, you meant evil. You meant harm. He names the sin. He doesn't, kind of walk around it. But he also says, hey, but God meant it for good. This is the mystery, right? This is the mystery and the comfort of God's promises and his providence. In fact, as followers of Jesus, we know that we can have peace in every situation, right? That's why the Apostle Paul can write from prison, that you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, right? That's why he writes that. But here we are today, and this is going to be your first point. So if you're taking notes, you can see this today. You can write this in the day. God is able to redeem evil without being the author of evil. Okay? God is able to redeem evil without being the author of evil. And this is why this matters, because it matters because all of us eventually have to figure out what to do with pain. The pain in our lives, the pain we've inflicted on ourselves, the pain inflicted on ourselves by others. We have to figure out what to do with this. What do we do when people hurt you? What do you do when life doesn't make sense? What do you do when someone really did mean evil against you? What do you do when the wound is real, the loss is real, and the betrayal is real? Well, look at Joseph. When we see him, the answer is not denial. Instead, it's faith. He didn't excuse evil. He didn't take God's place. In fact, in Deuteronomy 32 and again in Romans 12, you'll read these words. It says, it is mine to avenge. The Lord's talking here. It is the Lord's to avenge. I will repay. In due time, their foot will slip. Their day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them. So just like Joseph, we need to trust God is bigger than what people might have meant. So let's start reading. Let's see what God has for us today. What we're going to do is we're going to begin in Genesis 50. And if you've been with us, if you've been going through this series with us, if you were specifically here last week, you might be asking, hey, what's going on here, Justin? We ended last week in chapter 45. What about all the in-between chapters? Well, those are important too, but for the sake of the theme of the series and where we're going, we're moving to chapter 50. And as we read, we're actually starting verse 15, and it's going to be a little jarring because you're really going to notice what you've missed, and you've missed a bunch. So read with me in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him?" All right, so a lot has happened. There's actually been 17 years between chapter 45 that we read last week and chapter 50 when Dad is gone. A lot has happened. And so after 17 years of living near Joseph in Egypt, their father Jacob has died. The father of the family is gone. Suddenly, Joseph's brothers, now they're afraid. And why are they afraid? Because why should they be afraid? I mean, Joseph forgave them already, right? Should they be afraid? You remember back in 45, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. They're terrified. And Joseph says, no, come near to me. And he wept over them, and he embraced them, and he provided for them, and he brought the whole family to Egypt, and he gave them a place to live. And for years, 17 years, Joseph cares for them. He hasn't harmed them. He hasn't punished them. He never used his power to get revenge. And now Jacob's dead, and the brothers start thinking, maybe Joseph was only nice because Dad was alive. And they wonder, what if? What if he's just been waiting? What if all these years he's been holding it in, and now Joseph's coming for us? And that's what fear does. Fear questions grace. It questions grace even after grace has already been shown. And I think we can all understand that. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people that struggle with being saved and forgiven by God's grace. People who come to me asking, well, but am I good enough? Do I deserve this? And the answer now is the same as the day that Jesus saved you. No. No, you're not good enough. You're not deserving of God's grace, but you just get it anyway. And we tend to make something that should be very comforting, very difficult, and very stress-inducing, because it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the fact that we are forgiven when we don't deserve forgiveness. And that's what's happening with these brothers. Because church, sometimes grace can be hard to receive. Some people struggle to believe that they have actually been forgiven. And here, Joseph's brothers, they're living under the shadow of their own guilt. Their fear, it's not because Joseph has been cruel. It's because their conscience is still troubled. They still know what they did. They know that they betrayed their brother. They know that they sold him. They know that they lied to their father. They know Joseph had every earthly reason to be angry. And even though Joseph has already shown grace to them, they're still afraid. And that's what unresolved guilt does. It makes grace feel like it's just too good to be true. So here's your next point. Fear often returns where grace has already been given. Look at verse 16. Look what they do. So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs that they committed, treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of God, your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. No, I don't know if Jacob actually said this or if the brothers are just making it up because they're afraid. Either way, they're scared. You can see their fear. They're still trying to manage Joseph. They're still trying to protect themselves. They're still trying to control all the outcomes. And at the end of verse 17, it says, when their message came to him, Joseph wept. And this is such a great response because Joseph doesn't rage at him. He doesn't say, finally, I can get even. He weeps, he cries. And we don't even know entirely why he cries. Maybe he realizes that they still don't trust his forgiveness. Maybe because the wound is still tender. Maybe it's because sin has done so much damage in his family. Maybe grace has been given, but it's because fear is still ruling their hearts. But this is a deeply human moment here because forgiveness doesn't always erase the memory of what happened, does it? Reconciliation doesn't mean that the past never happened, and it doesn't mean that the past never mattered. Grace is beautiful, but sin still leaves scars. And so Joseph weeps. And this might be why God brought you here today. So hear this. Because sometimes we think that faith means, hey, there's never any reason to cry. Things are all good. We're okay. We think trusting God means that the wound should just disappear. But Joseph, right, he's a man of deep faith. And if he has anything that he could ever want, he's second in command of all of Egypt. He has everything. But he weeps. So listen, the presence of tears does not mean the absence of faith. Right? Just because you have tears doesn't mean that you lack faith. You can trust God and you can still grieve. You can forgive and you can still feel the weight of what happened. You can believe God is good and you can still admit that sin has caused or is causing real pain. Joseph wept. Jesus wept too. Joseph wept, and his tears did not lead to revenge. His tears led him into further grace. And so for you and me, when you forgive someone, and that little thought creeps in and reminds you of the pain that was inflicted upon you, and you feel that hurt all over again, instead of feeling like a failure, forgive again. Look to Jesus, right, who always forgives you, and then just rest in his love for you. And remember, forgiveness, right? Forgiveness refuses to take God's place, okay? What does it mean to take God's place? Like, it just means that I'm in control, right? Forgiveness refuses to take God's place. And again, as we've already said, as we've seen over and over again, we let God handle retribution, right? That's not for us. And so look at verse 18. His brothers then came and they threw himself down before him. We are your slaves, they said. And just think about that for a second. This is the fulfillment of Joseph's dream back in Genesis 37. Remember he dreams and that the brothers would all bow down before him? Years early, Joseph had that dream. That dream made them hate him. That dream was one of the reasons that they even sold him in the first place, that they wanted to get rid of him. And now here they are, they're bowing down before him. And their posture, it's not a worshipful posture. They're not worshiping him. It's fearful. They say, no, just be nice to us. We are your slaves. They're offering themselves as servants because they're terrified of his punishment. And look what Joseph does in 19. Joseph says to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And that's one of the most important questions in this whole story. Am I in the place of God? Joseph has power, he has authority, he has position, he has the ability to make their lives miserable. He could use his power to repay evil for evil, but he doesn't. How many of you have been, or even now, maybe in a place where repaying evil for evil sounds good to you? Right, maybe you have someone where you're like, yeah, nothing would please me more than to make them suffer. Joseph, he understands something. He says, vengeance belongs to God. It's not for him. And now again, forgiveness, right? It doesn't mean that you pretend evil didn't happen. And forgiveness doesn't mean that justice doesn't matter. Forgiveness doesn't mean that abusers should be protected or consequences should be removed. Some things require cops and jail time, okay? But forgiveness simply means that I don't climb onto God's throne and I don't make myself the final judge. So Joseph says, am I in the place of God? In other words, I'm not God. I don't see everything that God sees. I don't know everything that God knows. I'm not the ultimate judge. I'm not the one who holds the universe together, and I'm definitely not the one who writes the final chapter. And so this is where humility kind of enters into forgiveness. Because bitterness, right, it often grows when we put ourselves in God's place. We replay the story, we rehearse the events, we imagine what they deserve. We write the sentences in our minds that we're going to say over and over again. And slowly our heart starts to become a courtroom where we get to be the judge, jury, and executioner. But Joseph says, that seed is not mine. That belongs to God. And it should free us. Because some of us are exhausted of trying to do God's job, trying to control outcomes, trying to make sure everyone gets what they deserve, and trying to carry the weight of judgment. That's a lot to carry. And Joseph says, no, I'm not God. And again, that doesn't make evil okay. It simply means God is God, I am not. And so God is saying evil matters so much that he will deal with it perfectly. So we can release revenge. God is in control. He's a better judge than we are. And then here's the most beautiful thing. Joseph isn't only going to refuse revenge, he's actually going to offer them reassurance. Look at verse 21. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. He reassures them. And then it says, and he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So church, if you're wondering what grace looks like, that's it. Joseph's not like, okay, fine, I won't hurt you, but don't ask me for anything. He says, I will provide for you. He goes that next step. He doesn't just remove punishment, he gives provision. He offers care. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. And we might look at that phrase that spoke kindly, and we might say, oh, nice, oh, great, Joseph's a nice guy, that's awesome. But it can actually also carry a different idea, and the idea here is speaking to the heart. That's what forgiveness does. Forgiveness won't keep people forever in the identity of what they did. Joseph speaks to their fear. He speaks to their guilt. He speaks to their shame. He speaks to the place in them that still can't believe that this grace is even real. Joseph doesn't just call them, he doesn't say, hey man, you're the brothers that sold me. He calls them family. He cares for them. He cares for their children. He reminds them of the story. It reminds me of the story that Jesus tells of the prodigal son. who's going to beg his father, please make me a servant in your household, after squandering his inheritance. But the father, he doesn't call him prodigal. He doesn't call him wayward or servant. He calls him son. Let's be clear, though, right? That doesn't mean that every relationship can or should go back to what it was before, right? Some situations, they require boundaries. Some situations require distance. Some situations require protection and accountability. But in Joseph's case, where repentance and reconciliation are happening, forgiveness refuses to keep revenge alive. Joseph will not take God's place, and neither should we. All right, we skipped verse 20. We read it earlier, but we skipped it here. Let's look at it again, because it's the best and most famous verse in all of Joseph's story. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, this is the heartbeat of Joseph's story. Joseph says that two things are true at the same time. And he doesn't soften it. He's like, here it is. First, you planned evil against me. That's true. He doesn't rename it. And then he tells the truth, right? He's like, you intended to harm me. The hatred, it was evil. The betrayal, it was evil. Lying to your father, it was evil. Abandoning your brother, it was evil. And the Bible, it never requires us to call evil good in order to trust that God is good. It's important that we see that, because sometimes Christians can speak about suffering in ways that almost sound like the evil itself was good, right? Someone's grieving and we're real quick to say, well, God has a plan. God does have a plan, by the way, but maybe it's the wrong time. Or everything happens for a reason, and we rush past the pain because we just want to get to the lesson, and we don't see that here. Joseph's clear. You meant evil. So, church, faith is not denial. Faith looks evil in the face, and it tells the truth. But then Joseph says something else, which is also true. God planned it for good. The same event, right, had two different intentions. The brothers had evil intention, and God has good intention. The brothers were responsible for their sin, and God is still in control of the story. The brothers meant to destroy Joseph, but God meant to position Joseph. The brothers meant to get rid of him, and God sent him ahead. The brothers meant death, and God meant life. And that's what he does for us. That's what God does for us. God is so wise, he's so good, that he can take evil that was meant for destruction, and he can just kind of weave it into his saving purposes. So hear this. God is able to redeem evil without being the author of evil. God's not morally responsible for the evil of Joseph's brothers. But he was sovereign enough, he's in control enough to use even their evil for his good purpose. And it's not easy for us to understand, but it should be comforting. Because here's what it means. The worst thing that has ever happened to you is not more powerful than God. And I hate right now that because of that statement, you might be thinking of the worst thing that ever happened to you. But I hope you can find healing in the fact that it's still not more powerful than God. And like Joseph, my hope is that over time, you can say that what they meant for evil in your life, God meant for good. That where things got hard, or maybe some of you, right, you're still in the middle of that. Maybe you're not able to say it yet. But at some point, you'd be able to say, I see the good. It's easy to confuse God's silence with God's absence, or his timing with neglect. And so I urge you to take it to Jesus. Let God have your story. No matter where it is, no matter where you are in it, let him have it. Give it to him. God might be doing something in the hidden years that we can't understand in the moment. Because that's what Joseph's story shows us. Guess what? God's meant it for good can actually last for generations. I mean, just think about the cross, right? The cross is the ultimate God meant it for good. And so in Genesis 50:20, right? It's a you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. It's a window into this idea. But the cross is the clearest picture of what this looks like. Because at the cross, human beings meant evil for Jesus. Judas, right? He meant betrayal. The religious leaders, they meant removal. The crowds meant rejection. Satan meant destruction. The cross was not an accident. And the people who crucified Jesus, they were responsible for their evil. But God meant it for good. Acts 2:23 says this, and this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. You see two truths there that are both true: human responsibility and divine sovereignty. Lawless people killed Jesus, but God plans redemption through Jesus. They meant evil, but God meant good. At the cross, the worst evil became the greatest good. The innocent Son of God was rejected so that guilty sinners like you and me could be received. Jesus was condemned so that you could be forgiven. Jesus was pierced so that you could be healed. Jesus went to the grave so that you can have resurrection life. They meant it for evil. God meant it for good. And it's not even just a small good. It's the greatest good, right? The salvation of many people. And this is why Joseph's story, right? It's not just moral inspiration. It's more than be like Joseph and forgive, right? We should learn that. That's a good thing. But Joseph is also, he's pointing us to Jesus. He doesn't even know it, but he's pointing us to Jesus. The whole Bible does this. What people could do imperfectly, Jesus does perfectly, rescuing us for all of eternity. And here's the good news. Jesus does not merely forgive from a distance. Like Joseph said to his brothers, he said, "Come near to me." Jesus says, "Come near." Bring your guilt and your fear and your shame and your sin. Bring the sin that was committed against you. Come near to Jesus. Because at the cross, we see that God can be trusted even when things are dark, even in the most bleak of moments. All right, it's your last point. And it's probably the hardest one to live in. But when we find peace and hope, we find that hope rests in God's promise, not our ability to understand. Right? If we can just catch that, if we can hold that, we will find peace. We will find rest. Hope rests in God's promise, not our ability to understand. It's a hard one, right? I want to understand everything. AI has probably been the worst thing for me because I ask it 1,000 questions a day because I want to know everything in the world. And my wife laughs at me because she's like, why do you even care about that? But it's weird things I just want to know, right? And so to be able to hold this truth that I don't have to understand everything is rough. Then our passage is going to end with Joseph's death. Look at verse 22. It says, Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years. Joseph, he lives a full life. He sees generations come after him. But before he dies, he says something important in verse 24. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid, and he will take you up to this land, the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph knows that Egypt is not their final home. Even though God used Egypt to preserve them, Joseph knows that God's promise is tied to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Joseph says, God will come to your aid. And while Joseph is dying, he is still trusting God's promise. He's still looking after the families of those who hurt him. That's real forgiveness. And he lets them know God will come to your aid. And while leaders die, and parents die, and Joseph dies, God's promises do not die. Joseph knows that his life is not the whole story. He knows that his generation is not the end. He knows God will continue what he started. And then in verse 25, it says, and Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. That's a weird one, right? Joseph wants his bones carried to the promised land. And it might sound strange, but it's actually a very powerful statement of faith. What Joseph is saying here is that even when I'm dead, I believe God is going to keep his promise, and my bones are going to preach when my mouth no longer can. My grave is going to testify that Egypt is not the end. My burial instructions are going to say, God will come through. If you know anything about the next chapter starts with, there is a new Pharaoh who did not know. And everything is changed, and the Israelites are imprisoned, and they're not imprisoned, enslaved. And here they are, they're enslaved, and they're under all of this depression and work. And so when they leave and they carry Joseph's bones, they are speaking. By faith, Joseph dies, believing in a failure he will not see with his earthly eyes. He dies, trusting that God will bring his people home. And that's how Genesis ends. Joseph dies. It doesn't end with everything resolved. Now with Israel, Israel's not in the promised land. The suffering isn't finished. Genesis ends with a burial in Egypt. Verse 26, so Joseph died at the age of 110. After they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. That's the last verse of Genesis. A coffin in Egypt. That seems like a strange ending, doesn't it? Let's check this out, though. It's nuts. But Genesis begins with creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It begins with life, it begins with beauty, it begins with order and goodness. And then because of sin, Genesis ends with death. A coffin in Egypt, leaving us longing for more. But it's not hopeless. Because that coffin is waiting. It's waiting for the day that God's going to aid his people. It's waiting for the Exodus. It's waiting for deliverance. It's waiting for God to keep his promise. And one day in Exodus, God does exactly what Joseph said he would do, and God comes to the aid of his people. And God raises up Moses, and God brings them out of slavery. And Exodus 13 tells us that Moses took Joseph's bones with them. God kept his promise. Church, Genesis ends with a coffin, but the Bible does not end that way. The story keeps going. And ultimately, the story leads us to another tomb, because Jesus was crucified, and Jesus died, and he was buried, and the stone was rolled in front of that tomb. And for a moment, it looks like evil won again, and it looks like death had the final word, and it looks like the promise has failed. But early one Sunday morning, the stone is rolled away. Jesus rose from the dead. The tomb is empty. And because Jesus lives, we have hope beyond the coffin. Joseph's bones, right, they pointed towards a future deliverance. Jesus' empty tomb declares that deliverance has come. So our hope is not wishful thinking. Our hope is anchored in the resurrection of Jesus. God will come to our aid. God will keep his promise. God will finish what he started.